Hello and welcome. I'm Krista Forey, the Operations Manager at the Columbia Global Centers in Paris, and I'm joined today by photojournalist Bruce Frankel, who's here to discuss the inspiration for his recently published book. It was The Turn of the Century, or C'était le tournant du siècle. This book gives readers a visual sort of before and after of the Twin Towers in New York City from 1973 through 2017. A former cameraman and journalist for TF1 for over 20 years, his work has taken him from New York to Jerusalem, Washington to Hong Kong, and he's with us in Paris today. Bruce, thank you for being here.
Thank you for inviting me.
If we could, I'd like to just launch into some questions for you. Mm-hmm. So I'd like to begin by asking you what your original thoughts were on photographing the Twin Towers in the early 70s. What was the impetus? Why did you choose these towers?
Well, the towers were out of proportion. I moved to New York in 1974.
From where, just to have a point of reference? Okay.
And for Lower Manhattan, these towers were completely out of proportion. Downtown, the first section of Manhattan to be developed, low buildings, small streets. So these two rectangles were suddenly there. It changed the
entire landscape.
Yes. In fact, if you looked at New York from the distance, it almost seemed like there were two cities. You had above 34th Street with the Empire State Building in Midtown, and then you had, the distance was substantial, and you had the two towers to the south. But as a young photographer, playing with material, the film, the processes, different cameras, seeing what worked best for me, the two towers were just an interesting object to photograph or to shoot motion picture film of 16 millimeter Super 8.
Additional point of reference for viewers who might not know. Not only were the towers strange for the Manhattan skyline, being that they were behemoth, but when they were erected in 1973, they were the tallest buildings in the world.
Brief period. And for New Yorkers who had a great attachment to the mythology of the Empire State Building, this was horrible that there were two buildings on the same island that were bigger than the beloved building of King Kong.
You know how we love competition.
Yeah. But there wasn't a real, I had no particular obsession with the buildings. They were objects to be photographed for different photographic concerns, as I say. Experimenting with a film type, a development process. And if I can say, jumping ahead a little bit, this narrative really fell into place after the attack, when I realized the significance of my photographs that contained the World Trade Center after they were no longer there. So the narrative came later than the
So you weren't in the process of documenting these towers necessarily from A to Z. It wasn't a conscious thing you had going on. It wasn't until after they were felled that you realized you had all of these photographs.
I realized there was a narrative then that was not just dislocated, photographs that were not tied together. An infrared photograph of the towers was a study of what the old Ektachrome infrared film could do. The towers were just convenient. The frame was just a perfect frame at the moment that I shot it. In the late 90s, I went back to film the towers playing with black and white because I love the form. I love the shadow, and black and white. It's all about gray tones and the contrast and the form. So these were purely visual photographic things. But then when the attack happened, the towers took on a deeper significance for me.
Is it safe to say that the largeness of these two edify and how they remain static until they were no longer made them the perfect objects to experiment with shadows and light? Was it something about...
I would say that, yes. And of course, there's always this great idea of contrasting the old with the new, the irony that one can read into a photograph. But particularly with the great setting sun of the west over the Hudson River, over New Jersey, the variations of light were quite spectacular. And particularly with black and white, I've always felt that New York, Manhattan, is black and white during the day, and it only becomes a city of color when the
illuminated at night.
Night lights come on. So this was sort of natural feeling for me, apart from any kind of symbolic reasoning.
Sure, we don't know what we don't know until hindsight is 2020. But did you know? So you didn't know at the time that this would be any sort of documentation. You were experimenting with shadows and light and some filters. I think I don't want people to get the impression that your entire book is in black and white, because there are some pretty significant colored photos, and you can.
Yes, I worked a lot for controlling the film. I love contrast in black and white, so there are different filters which enhance that. But I've also always felt that black and white and color, I learned from black and white to be better with color. Or when I get tired of seeing things in color, I go back to black and white, because black and white's, I don't know what black and white is. Not natural. What does it represent? The buildings are not black and white. We don't see in black and white, and yet that was how photography first started. But in the exhibition, what was important for me as well is the fact that the towers were one part of the New York landscape. So there's Central Park, there are people, there's 42nd Street and activity. And my idea really was that the pre-attack, the towers were very much part of that landscape and part of my experimentation.
So did you find that your photographic style changed as the city changed, or did it change maybe as technology changed, or was it a combination of the two?
Well, I hope it changed just by knowledge gained. I would think that my concerns, there was certainly an evolution in my concerns. And of course, your brain and your eye are trained, that they advance, they become more precise, and the questions become more precise that a photographer, or I suppose any type of artist, wishes to wants to do. You know, it's always there are always more questions, even if they're tiny questions, but they're the questions that lead to continued creativity. So I'd say.
So sort of a combination of the two.
Right, but yes, but at a certain point, with the question of technology, I was pretty much wed to film, and there was a whole revolution that became numeric, digital, and I've done my best to keep it at bay, because I still like the basic process of light hitting the sensitized silver object. That with slides you could see with your eye, which was a wonderful thing. You didn't need a machine to
Depends.
no, but you didn't need a machine to read it like
Right.
digital. You need machines to read what the images are.
If I could I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. What would you say was the impetus for deciding to compile these photos so many years actually after the towers were felled? Did you feel like it was a responsibility that you had to fulfill? Was it just an idea that came to you one day when you found a stockpile of photos you'd taken previously?
Well, I had covered the aftermath of the attack right away. I was based in Washington at the time, and we came to New York, and I spent most of that year of 2001 in New York, chasing for stories, chasing for video images. And at the same time, when I wasn't working, I wanted to document things as I could on my photos. And I had an idea of my archives with the, honestly, up until February 2001, I was shooting the towers in black and white. So they were very present before the attack. I just felt it was a way to mark a break in time, and visually interesting as well.
Sure. Can you talk a little about when you were in Washington, D.C., the towers were felled, and it was on the day that you drove up?
Yes, well, I received a phone call. I worked for the French television, and 6 hours ahead with Washington. And in Paris, they called right away as soon as the first plane hit and said that go to New York right away. We had no New York office at this time. And they said for them it was a terrorist attack. They had no doubt in their mind.
Even before it had been announced as such?
Well, I think it was only considered a terrorist attack after the second airplane hit. That it wasn't two accidents. And with my colleague, my correspondent, we hopped on a train, which ended up being the last train from the Washington heading toward Penn Station. We got as far as Baltimore, and then we had to take taxi cabs, one from Baltimore and then the second one from Philly to where we had a satellite truck waiting. You know, on all world events, there is great world coverage. Every television network is in a is with in a news service. So they're receiving images all the time. What's important is that our correspondent is there, and that our correspondent gets on the air. And then once we get there and we establish our presence, we start racing to find news stories.
Right.
So we raced up, and I just had the clothes on my back. Our editor from Washington drove up later in the day, but it was really camping for, and it was, of course, a very difficult moment.
If I could stop you, I'd like to ask about what it's like being a photographer and oftentimes capturing someone's most difficult moment in life. Do you feel like there's distance between you and the person because there's a lens in between you, or do you find that being a photographer sort of has an inherent empathy that allows you to get closer to the subject? How did you go about that? Because it was really hard for a lot of people to talk about. Even still, it's hard for people to talk about.
It comes down to the individuals in front of you. Some people love to open their souls on the camera, for the camera. Other people don't want to see you at all. But you're kind of a thief, basically. You have to be aggressive, and you have to impose yourself, and you have to be ready to be rejected. And you also would like to catch as much of the natural setting as possible. You don't want to make it seem like a staged interview. That's not really honest or effective. So it's something you learn with time, of course. And New Yorkers, I think, like to open up to be on TV.
But certainly there's an archival aspect there as well. I mean, I would assume for people that take photographs and video, people that write, this sort of way of preserving what's happening for generations to come, no?
Yes, I think when you're working, you're not thinking of you're not thinking that you're writing history or contributing material that will be incorporated into history because you have deadlines as a journalist and you're working fast, you have competition, the guy next to you, the woman that's shooting over there. You don't want them to get the picture before you do, so there is this aspect of absolutely being in the moment because TV just eats images. It just eats and eats. It has to be fed constantly. So we understood that this was the story. This was the turn of the century.
Sure. With some distance between now and having taken these photos, do you feel differently? Do you feel like there's less, you don't have to be aggressive about it? Now do you feel like there's an archival aspect? Do you feel like it's art? Do you feel like you've contributed in some way? And
well, in the exhibition, I have this kind of almost naive artistic vision of New York, of how I took pictures and was learning. Then in the middle, there is this section that's journalism, and this is where we have the before and after pairs and the shots of the destruction and the cleanup and the rebuild. And the third wall is the back to thinking photographically, but for me it was very hard to see New York without having 9/11 and the Twin Towers in my mind. And as a journalist, I followed the rebuilding of the Freedom Tower. So I would say that with this anniversary that just passed, I contacted people who I had followed their lives from 2001, people who had been very open with me and very kind, and people who I saw had suffered a lot. And I felt very close to these handful of people. Because as a journalist, you do anniversary, and then the 10-year was very important, with more stories and more depth to the tragedy that actually happened. And the other part is that the generation is getting old. So I do think it's important that this is all marked for young people who aren't born yet to know that this event happened.
Sure. Bruce, thank you again for joining us.
It's my pleasure. It's information that's important. It was the turn of the century.
I agree with you. For all of you watching at home, please stay tuned for the last slide, where you can find out how to purchase Bruce's book, and also the directions to the Atelier Bergère, where his exposition is being held for the next week. Am I right?
October 7th, yes.
Perfect. On behalf of all of us at the Columbia Global Centers in Paris, thank you for watching.